Welcome to Plus 3. This episode was recorded before the widespread acknowledgement of the impacts of the coronavirus in the US. We decided to sit on this episode in order to engage with some of the pressing realities around COVID-19 and social responses within psychedelic spaces and broader society. We also wanted to make sure that our engagement with this important topic didn't get lost in the maelstrom of coronavirus media coverage. In light of the current discourse about ethics and bad actors in psychedelic spaces, we felt that now was an appropriate moment to release this episode and highlight some of the long-standing abuses in the context of medicalized psychedelics. So with that said, here are some of our thoughts on psychedelic therapy's sexual abuse problems. So welcome to Plus 3, y'all. This week, we're going to be talking about an article that just came out in courts. Olivia Goldhill published an article dealing with sexual abuse in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So we're going to be going over some of the histories and issues that she laid out. We're going to discuss the breakdown of the various themes that come up in the different examples, things that are and have plagued psychedelic therapy for a number of years. We're going to look at some of the broader issues we see where the stories don't add up, where we've got interesting denials now on the record. One of the really interesting things about this article is that it's entered a bunch of information into the public record, things that a number of us have been talking about for years, but I think in some cases, folks have maybe made them out to be postures or sort of generalized conceptual stories, but now we have some of that specifically documented. And then hopefully at the end, we'll be able to look at a little bit of what we might be able to do, or at least raise questions about where we can go from here as a broader community, as smaller communities and individuals. And even if we don't wind up with a whole lot of answers, our hope is that we'll be able to sort of position this discussion to be an ongoing one and hopefully invite a whole bunch of other people into these conversations and go from there. So with that being said, we've actually got a guest on this show, Nishay.
Yeah, so we're really lucky to have Lily K. Ross, who was a early advocate of a lot of the themes we're going to be talking about today and early inspiration for me and work that I've done. So Lily holds a Master's of Divinity from Harvard and has completed her PhD dissertation in gender studies at the University of Otago. Is that how you say that?
Otago.
Otago. Okay. Her PhD examines social responses to victims of sexual violence and expectations placed on victims to grow and improve themselves through suffering. And she's consulted universities on best practice in sexual violence and prevention and response, and has served as an expert consultant on various institutions' sexual misconduct policy and procedures. She continues to research, reporting, and due process. She's also a reformed aspiring psychedelic therapist. She left the field in 2015 after 2.5 years of trying to spark conversation and action around sexual misconduct by various under and above ground psychedelic practitioners. She's advanced analysis on the contours of this type of abuse and the silencing tactics unique to the psychedelic community. Despite having removed herself from many psychedelic spaces, she remains committed to information sharing and solidarity in this area. And thank you so much, Lily, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks
For having me.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify real quick that the article by Olivia Goldhill, the title was "Psychedelic Therapy Has a Sexual Abuse Problem." So I'm really glad that we're dedicating some space to talk about this, and I'm really glad that we have Lily along with us. So along with us as well as Dave Nichols, Nishay Devno, Brian Norman. Hello.
Hello. Hey. Hope everyone's doing well. So I guess let's just get into it. Olivia's article was sort of long brewing and gets into these systemic issues through the lens of a case that unfolded as a result of a MAPS Canada study involving Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer, who were the investigators. We could also say they were the therapists, although Jensen kind of denies that at one point, and a woman named Megan Buisson. I may be pronouncing that wrong. But essentially what happened is that Megan was enrolled as a subject in this MAPS Canada study, and ultimately alleged that there was a sexual relationship with Richard Jensen. And Olivia sort of starts the article off by giving a rundown of a talk that Jensen gave back in 2016 at the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, that featured a number of disturbing quotes. One of Jensen's quotes was, "There was another subject in that study, a lovely young lady who became very sexualized in her relationship around the sessions. It got so intense, I remember the chairman of our department kind of walked by and saw her sitting with me and talking with me, and he picked up on the energy she was putting out, and he said, 'Richard, come here. You know, I'm 20 years old.' He said, 'You know, gynecologists, they always have a co-therapist with them. They always have a nurse in the room whenever they examine someone. I want you to make sure you always have somebody with you when you're with this patient.' Thank God, because she became more and more and more activated sexually and was able to work it through and was able to get through the process of therapy and get well. But it was, I don't think I could have handled it. I really don't think I could have as a young therapist." He also made the statement that in the early 80s, when MDMA was not yet scheduled, I ran across, unfortunately, large numbers of people where there was sexual acting out and difficulties, where therapists would be involved with multiple patients sexually. I think that's a particular thing with phenethylamines. They need constant supervision, where therapists can come and talk about the real struggles that they're going through. And also therapist and co-therapist teams are really important to temper the tendencies to act things out. So here we have this talk that's documented at CIIS with Richard and Donna. And there's a number of really, I think, troubling themes that come up. I mean, the notion that somehow phenethylamines put people in therapists in particular in positions where they're going to be engaged with patients who are acting out sexually, and as a result they need constant supervision. That this particular professional is so concerned about his ability to control his own sexual urges and proclivities that he's being told by his supervisor that he should have someone in the room, and he himself is scared that if he doesn't have someone else monitoring him in those moments, that he might act out or abuse people sexually. To me, that I would think that would be disqualifying from being a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. Curious what y'all think.
Well, I mean, I think in some context is, important in the sense that, like, this is something that Jensen had said, years prior to the case with Megan Buisson.
Well, actually, for whatever it's worth, he said this at a point where this is in the course of the relationship, not relationship, sorry, but of his misbehavior
with this individual.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, so she definitely moved to Cortez Island for this therapy, which is in BC, in Vancouver. And so she had upended her life to be a part of this therapeutic endeavor. And so this relationship, like, definitely went beyond what most people would consider a normal relationship from the get-go, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think something really common in psychedelic therapy, though, is that a lot of relationships are dual relationships. I think this is problematic, but there's a sense of, like, that people might be friends or might refer their friends to a mutual friend for therapy. Like, the boundaries are often a bit more blurred than if somebody's just walking in off the street or subject to a professional series of referrals. And I think that is something that contributes to an environment where some of those boundaries seem more permeable. They're not more permeable, they shouldn't be, but they seem that way. And that, I think, creates some openings for exploitation.
Well, and yes, and it also gets into some of these games that certain therapists play, sort of operating both in the above ground and below ground. And people are usually quick to say, well, that's why we need medicalization and that's why we need legalization, because that's how we get licensure. And once we have licensure, that'll be in place. But I think it's really important to point out that in this case, after the allegations came out against Jensen, people started realizing that he didn't actually have a psychologist license. He let that license lapse in 2009, and I think it was only in the US. I don't think he was ever licensed in Canada. And so he worked alongside Donna Dreyer, his wife, who was licensed. And the way that the MAPS protocol is set up, it only requires one person per team to be licensed. And so the part of the stated reason for that is that it keeps insurance costs down. But as has been pointed out at various points, if you don't have a license, it can't be revoked. It sort of puts that under threat, or it removes that potential professional threat. And that also raises questions about these therapist dyads, where you've got one person who's licensed, one person who's not, and who are potentially married couples who have potentially known each other for years. Sort of what are the dynamics around that? And so going from the initial recognition that something had happened, Buisson
Dave,
said that yeah, sorry.
Real quick, do you think you could clarify what the allegations were in this case for everyone?
So as I understand it, Buisson said that there had been an intimate sexual relationship between her and Richard Jensen. At some point, to my understanding, Donna Dreyer became aware of that relationship, but didn't report it to anyone. I think for something like close to a year, thereabouts in that ballpark. I mean, this actually gets to a little bit of the other timeline. So I'll circle back to that in a moment, where Buisson says that she informed Brad Burge, the communications director at MAPS, in January of 2018 that this had gone on. Now Burge denies this. Apparently MAPS had told the participants to contact the IRB with concerns or complaints, and she did that in January 2018 as well. But apparently the IRB said they couldn't investigate because the trial was over. So then she ended up reaching out to Michael Mithofer, who's one of the investigators for MAPS. And that was, I think, in October of 2018. And there were court documents that had come out, or that had been filed amidst this, where basically Buisson alleged this relationship. Jensen didn't deny the relationship. He just said that the relationship was totally consensual, and that it was initiated by Buisson, and that at no point, and this was some of the really slimy, in my opinion, sort of argumentation that was used. Jensen asserted that at no point were they in a doctor-patient relationship, that because he had no credentials, he wasn't a doctor, he just plays one in these studies. He's actually an investigator. And, as a result, there's no real duty of care.
So let's back up real quick here, because I think that we're starting to get into some details, but we haven't really fully done justice to this basic narrative where, so if we're to understand what is at issue here, there's a violation of a patient therapeutic relationship, where we have the therapeutic dyad, where a wife and husband. The wife, Donna Dreyer, is a licensed psychologist. Jensen did go through training, and so Jensen did go through got off a little bit here. So Jensen did go through psychological training, but had let his license lapse. So in this situation, we had this pair, and a sexual relationship was initiated between Jensen and Buisson. And as a result, there was this claim that was filed. This relationship was described as sexual assault by Megan Boisson.
And maybe Lily could speak a bit to the issue with a therapist who, regardless of whether or not he had his licensing, he was acting as a therapist and providing therapy to this patient. Can you speak to why it's preposterous for him to claim that this was a consensual relationship initiated by the patient in that dynamic?
Sure. So when we look at the people who qualify for these studies, there are people who are highly vulnerable and have a diagnosis of PTSD, and who, in order to be included in the studies, they have to demonstrate that they have been treatment resistant. So we're looking at a highly vulnerable and desperate population that is needing help and support, and their only access in the context of prohibition, their only access to these materials is through a licensed therapist, unless they're willing to go into the underground. And even there, it seems like the access is limited to a therapeutic context. And so already we have a power differential where somebody has access to a very limited therapeutic resource on the one hand, and then somebody who whose life may depend on accessing that resource. And then you have just the standard professional boundaries of, there's a reason why psychiatrists, doctors, psychotherapists are subject to losing their licenses and serious repercussions if they're known to have a sexually active relationship with one of their patients. And it doesn't matter who starts it. What matters is that whether or not it happens. And it's seen as a really gross violation, really significant violation because of those power differences.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to note that I've heard a number of stories involving psychedelic therapists and sexual transgressions where the person, the patient initiates the sexual relationship, and I put that in air quotes. But I think that's really important because they're actually not, if you really look at what happens, they're set up to initiate it. So the therapist might position themselves and say, oh, we can't have a sexual relationship, that'll never happen. But then they use body language and touch and posturing and manipulate the situation such that a sexual relationship eventuates, and they have the plausible deniability of saying, well, it was the patient that crossed the line, I didn't cross the line. Mm-hmm. And yet, because there's nobody else in the room to see that, the therapist put the patient's head on his lap, or the therapist was touching the patient in this particular way, or moving things kind of in that sort of direction, then in the narration of the story, it's like, well, yeah, she made the move. But that just doesn't actually hold up if you're thinking very carefully about what leads up to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a failure to assert boundaries, which, I would imagine professional therapists talk a lot about.
In the best case scenario, it's a failure to assert boundaries. But I think in a lot of these cases, it's actually a very meticulous manipulation or mm-hmm. sequence of manipulations that are happening to entice or encourage a patient to make that move, and then to feel that they are to blame because they made that move, mm-hmm. and to construct plausible deniability for the therapist.
Yikes.
And that's why it feels really important to point out that these sorts of relationships are inappropriate, full stop. Like the fact that you have these power differentials regardless of the substances, but then you throw the substances and the suggestibility onto that. It's like, again, as I said with Jensen, if you are concerned about your ability to control your own sexual behavior, that should be disqualifying. If you have a fear of heights, you shouldn't be flying fighter jets or being an astronaut or things like that. This should just basically be, to my mind, a sort of basic principle for these practitioners. And
they've done research as well that it's never in the interest of the patient for this kind of relationship to happen, that they are there contractually, to heal, to deal with their own stuff and to get better. And that getting better does not involve sexual contact with the person who's supposed to be facilitating that.
Totally. And so one of the things that's been popping up, there have been a few people who've brought it up on social media. This has also been one of the dynamics that we've heard throughout the field, that, this article is titled Psychedelic Therapy Has a Sexual Abuse Problem, but this is only one example. Like, what evidence is there that psychedelic therapy has an abuse problem writ large? And so if we look through the therapeutic history, Torsten Passy actually put together an article that we'll link in the show notes, dealing with the early history of MDMA in therapeutic contexts. And he cites this paper by Harlow that, before he cites the Harlow paper, he discusses transgressions by Rick Ingrassi, Francesco De Leo. These were
those underground therapists?
So they were actually, to my recollection, they were actually above ground practitioners who engaged in underground psychedelic assisted therapy. At that point, I think it was in the 80s, and I don't believe MDMA had been scheduled yet, if I recall correctly. I'm not 100% sure on that.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
And so we have, and actually, so Passy cites Harlow, stating that the issues there were instrumental in establishing the therapist dyad. And it was only after they had established the therapist dyad for addressing these issues of sexual misconduct that suddenly they found off-label benefits of the dyad, that it actually did all of these other things, but it was prescribed, so to speak, for this sexual misconduct.
Right. And that wasn't fully spelled out in the argument. That's something that I sort of like thought of, just because I've been to so many conferences where people will say, oh, male female dyad, and this is to facilitate transference and parental kind of connections in the therapeutic relationship. I've heard that so many times, sort of Freudian psychodynamic version of that. And I had heard some, like from Alex Belser, for example, critiques of the heteronormative kind of premise baked into that. But I had never heard, until I read that actually the reason that was implemented after the 80s was to address this problem with sexual assault in those contexts. To qualify what you were saying, though, there were examples of the dyad being used in the first phase, so 50s and 60s, but the reason for the reinstating of the dyad was because of the sexual discretions that were plaguing the field.
Yeah. And I think that goes to this point that the dyad has been successfully rebranded.
This is exactly the problem, is that every time there has been something, there is this attempt to deal with it in private and to erase the signs of the problem from public view. And there are different reasons for that. This idea that we have to put our best foot forward and present a positive face to the field, but it also allows for things to keep happening. We saw this with Neil Goldsmith leaving Horizons and kind of one statement and then let's not talk about this anymore. And so I feel like part of the benefit of this article is having so much of this out in the open that even the people who were trying to erase the tracks now can't do that on such a big scale with different examples as well. So
I thought it was very thorough. And I mean, in this one extract in here that we talked about briefly before we started recording is, Rick Doblin acknowledges in his Harvard doctoral thesis, quote, the loving and trusting feelings that can be induced by MDMA can make patients more vulnerable to sexual pressure. And that, so it's definitely known to those who are experts in this field.
As Olivia pointed out, he didn't, sorry, Nisha.
No, I was going to say what you were saying. So go ahead.
Yeah, as Olivia pointed out, he didn't present that to the FDA. That wasn't on the informed consent documents for subjects or patients until after the issue with Sun. And there's a really interesting sort of follow-up to the point that Nisha just made about getting this on the record, and Pace, your point about how comprehensive it is. There was this story about Keith Ablow, who was a ketamine therapist, that came out, I think it was Boston Globe or something like that. We'll also link to that in the show notes. And it was in a mainstream outlet, but it's it it wasn't MAPS related. It wasn't sort of insular enough to some of the psychedelic science circles that people seem to not really have focused on it as an issue with a psychedelic therapist. And yet that had all of the red flags that we've discussed, right? It had patients, female patients who were looking at treatment-resistant diagnoses, who were sort of at their rope's end, willing to move across the country because they were in such dire straits, sort of looking for that last chance therapy that might be what they needed to address their situations. And then you have a therapist who's doing the sketchy things like seeing people outside of standard office hours, engaging in these boundary transgressions, and in really dominant and kind of disgusting ways. You know, I think the quote from the article headline is something like, "I own you," right? Which was a statement I believe he made to one of them. And so when we look at this therapeutic history, we can see that actually there are a number of clearly documented, really disturbing allegations and cases. And there's also a whole slew of allegations about folks in the underground and other above ground professionals who haven't yet, been publicly named.
It gets into really interesting territory as well, because I remember when I was sexually victimized in 2012 and started talking about my experience within psychedelic spaces. And at the time I knew dozens of therapists and a lot of people that are very involved with MAPS and trainings and all that kind of stuff. There was I was kind of shaken by the fact that people responded to me in a way that was simultaneously victim blaming, but also acknowledging that, like, yes, this is a problem. This has been a problem for some time. And also, like, the psychedelic movement will be damaged by this information becoming public. And therefore, you've got to shut up and it's your fault anyway, and please go away, was kind of the sentiment. And it's classic, and the irony of it is, as far as I can see, that, what is more scandalous than the sexual misconduct at a certain point, or as scandalous as the cover-ups and the silencing tactics. In this way, the psychedelic community is like every other like institutional context in the Me Too era, where it's like, it wasn't just that there were abuses, it was that a lot of people knew about them and worked very actively to keep them from public view, and worked very actively to avoid confronting them and dealing with them in ethical ways.
And part of it is for reasons of, career or their own kind of financial security. We see this with the example with MAPS's protocol, including, only one licensed therapist. And it's described as being cheaper for the patient, but actually it allows for people like Rick Doblin, as Olivia mentions in the article, to be a co-facilitator without having to go back and get a PhD. And so there are a lot of people who really want to do that work and have that job, and so they're willing to cut some corners and blanket over some problems because they think that end goal justifies the means.
Well, and that's also one of the things that is going to enable, medicalization to scale, actually. I think they would have a big scaling problem on their hand if they had to, not rely on, if they had to rely on therapists with PhDs. I don't think that they would be able to even do that in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this on previous episodes that, the medical model is inherently limiting in terms of access. And I mean, I think there was an honest, attempt to try and have a dyad and not make the, onus so hard that it's absolutely inaccessible. Getting, 2 PhDs in a room to do anything is difficult these days. That said, I mean, it does just point to the idea that this entirely medicalized model, as opposed to, say, working with a decriminalized situation, is inherently limiting to who can gain access under what circumstances, because we're talking about situations where people are already in places of authority. Having a PhD, puts people on a pedestal, whether it's real or not. And then you have this person as your therapist. And I think that, the entire psychedelic field stands on a giant foundation of people finding value in the psychedelic experience in completely non-clinical settings.
Absolutely.
There's all kinds of problems we could talk about that. But ultimately we're talking about cultural issues, and the culture that Lily was referring to, the cultural problem that we have with that was pointed out with the Me Too movement, is that there is a culture of silence, particularly when people's their professions, their reputations are at stake about what they didn't do when clearly they should have done something. And it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't, like our current discussion of these issues, it needs to go beyond simply creating some kind of safeguards so that abuses don't happen. It needs to address all of the existing people holding power who have, failed in some kind of duty of care.
And that
I think
I was going to say that happens outside of just the MAPS protocol therapeutic sessions, which is something that we'll need to get into, the other kinds of people that were included in Olivia's article.
Yeah, and the thing to add here is just that this does happen in various other communities, the yoga community, the just in all communities and institutions that this occurs. I think one of the differences here, and feel free to disagree, but there's also the elephant in the room is prohibition. And like advocates of psychedelic therapy are horrified that news articles are going to come out and collapse decades of work. And that has also contributed, in addition to everything else that exists in all these other communities and institutions, that has contributed to this atmosphere of looking the other way, putting more blame on the women, putting more blame on the messengers. We'll receive criticism for talking about this openly, because apparently, like, we're not supporting it, mainstreaming properly. And I think just after a while, all that's just going to add up, and it's going to create, like, there's going to be a moment of reckoning. When do you want that to happen? Do you want that to happen early on, where you can course correct and you can, take a long look in the mirror about how we're going to do this? Or do you want to wait until it's going to fall in your lap, from the outside? You are either going to self-regulate, or governments are going to move in and tell you how to operate. And I think that just looking at in other movements, like, there needs to be support for people who want to do this right from the beginning, instead of being afraid that if they speak out, that there's going to be that they're going to be ostracized from the community.
Yeah, I have a couple of points. One of them is that, like, just looping back to what Pace had said earlier, I think it's not just a culture of silence, it's a culture of actively silencing, right? And then we look at that in the context of psychedelic mainstreaming within what's still a prohibitionist context. I think prohibition enables abusers, in part because it does mean that accessibility is limited to these therapeutic relationships where there's this inherent power difference, and those that power difference is I think magnified in really significant ways by the fact that there's not, for many people, it seems there's no other way to access these materials except through that. I also think that, like, looking at Olivia's article, there was a point where I talked about just this concern that people threw at me, that by speaking out publicly, I was going to destroy 50 years of psychedelic research and activism single-handedly. which is interesting on so many levels, including that it suggests that the information I had was so severe and so volatile that it had the power to do that. And then that's like, well, why isn't this getting handled internally? And my logic with working with Rachel Monroe on the New York Magazine piece was that if I can't get people within the community to self-regulate, I need to shine a light externally and get the public agitated and concerned about this reality. And it's interesting too, because like I've talked with my good friend Simon about Olivia's article when it came out, and he was so shocked. And it's like every time I talk to people outside of the psychedelic community about this stuff, they are shocked and appalled. But when I talk to people within the psychedelic community, there's always all this kind of cognitive gymnastics that they're willing to do to kind of be like, oh, it's not that big of a problem. Oh, we don't really have the evidence. Oh, it doesn't merit actually doing something about it. And I think the quote from the researcher that wasn't willing to be named in Olivia's piece is wonderful.
Could we read that quote? Because
yeah.
I feel like it says so much in such a few sentences.
So Olivia writes, in the course of reporting the story, one psychedelics researcher Quartz reached out to said they didn't want to be interviewed and warned that this article could have negative consequences for the field. Quote, I'm a bit worried that mainly some very vocal people will be interviewed that will blame MAPS or the mainstreaming of psychedelic therapy for this incident, while these things are always much more nuanced and definitely not exclusive to psychedelic therapy. Real quick, that's a whataboutism fallacy. The fact that it's not exclusive to psychedelic therapy has nothing to do with the harms that are taking place in psychedelic therapy. Furthermore, the researcher says, I think it is important to have a constructive dialogue around these issues and challenges, but it can easily become polarizing and potentially damaging to the current developments as well. I hope that you are aware of that and are approaching this carefully.
I think a great way to translate that paragraph from that person who's not even willing to be named on the record is like, y'all could hurt my income, like damage to the field and its reputation is damage or like compromises my ability to keep making my income through this domain, and it just becomes this thing of like, and then people do this play to like, we need to get into the nuances, we need to get into and it's like, okay, but if we don't really lay out the facts as they stand, there's no baseline from which to get to the nuance that you're saying is so important. So like this to me just looks like a pathetic silencing tactic.
Yeah, without facts to hang on, nuance is impossible. That quote, it reminds me in just the discussion that we've been having about how, look, the psychedelic community isn't immune to these larger cultural problems that the Me Too movement has pointed out. There's a recent piece that was just published on March 5th by B. Schofield in The Guru called Master of Deceit, How Yogi Bhajan Used Kundalini Yoga for Money, Sex, and Power. And in this rather disturbing article that sort of parallels some of the abuses in the Bikram yoga world, there's this quote here from it's Matthew Remski. He's author of the book Practice and All Is Coming, about cults and Pathava Joyce abuse. He warns that one of the biggest obstructions to justice in yoga abuse crises is the false belief that reform can come from within an abusive organization. He continues, anyone who remains faithful to the internal logic and affect the group wants it to be perpetuated and will be allergic to the very questions that disturb that logic and effect.
So I think that this actually sort of leads into a good space to transition into some of our concerns and issues with these stories. But before doing that, I think there was a quote in the article that I'd like to come back to, where Lily was quoted talking about the need for outside accountability and institutions, and Rick Doblin denies that emphatically, and I'd like to talk about that more in a sec. But before we do, there's also this issue of unprofessional professionals, and we've talked about that really briefly here in the past. We're also planning on talking about that more in a future episode, but this notion of why are psychedelic therapy professionals so eager to engage in psychedelic drug use and experiences at conferences, at after parties? Why do we have MAPS employees and former MAPS employees on the record with different news outlets talking about going to events with MAPS where everyone is dosing and then experiencing problems around that? Sorry, go ahead, Nishay.
Not just everyone at the event, but like specifically the MAPS staffers at the event, just to clarify.
Right, and there's questions about what happens if you go on a retreat with your psychedelic nonprofit, or perhaps down the line with your regular corporate executive team. And what if you're there dosing with your bosses and underlings and supervisors? What if you're making all sorts of comments and statements under the influence of these drugs, which have a strong potential to affect sort of comfort levels and boundaries, and really, I think, confuse a lot of especially institutional hierarchies and power dynamics there. I mean, there's a whole mess here. And so when you have some of these people emphasizing how much fun or how much enjoyment they get out of dosing at these professional events, and then suddenly an article like this comes out, I think there's a reason why we see so much shock outside the community and such a lack of surprise and acknowledgement of open secrets within the community, which actually goes to a point as we sort of transition into some of the concerns and where we don't see the stories adding up. Nishay and I were at the Entheogenesis Australis conference back that was the end of 2017, I think December. And we were on a panel with Rick Doblin, Ben Sessa, Thomas Roberts, the two of us. We actually have some audio from that. But here, Nishay, I'll let you take it over because in the panel, you shared some really important stuff.
Right. Well, I had heard too much and seen too much about Neil Goldsmith at Horizons. And I actually decided before Harvey Weinstein, that story broke, that I needed to do something. Part of what I have felt compelled by is not, a desire for attention. It's not a desire to just like be problematic, but just seeing how the field treated Lily and seeing like how awful so many people were to receiving her story and her warning. I felt like I had a moral obligation to do something. And so I spent that year going to conferences around the world. I spoke, in Mexico and Canada and Australia, and every place I went, I said, we have predators at the highest levels of our field. And when I got off the stage after talking about that, Rick Doblin kind of made a beeline for me. And he asked, like, that person you were talking about, was that Neil Goldsmith? And I was just like the fact that he came up with the person with no context suggested that this was an open secret, that without any identifiable characteristics, he was able to guess who I was talking about is a red flag. And so in the article, the Olivia article, he responds to like recalling having had this conversation with me. And then he's asked, what did you do? And he's like, oh, I don't know. Maybe I talked to Neil. I don't really know. People say stuff about people, all the time. It's kind of the vibe he gave off. And to me, like that, as I was reflecting, like that doesn't make it's an outright lie, in my opinion, based on what actually happened. Because what actually happened was he was really upset. And he said specifically that he had just recently gotten reports from 2 different women who had reported actual sexual assault, rape, violations with this person. And the fact that he heard something now from me, he was alarmed, and he acknowledged that MAPS has given power and prestige to this person. And so he felt culpable if this was an actual thing, an actual problem. But the nature of my red flags that I shared with him, because they didn't reach the level of outright rape, he was relieved and he brushed them off and he was like, okay, well, at least it wasn't that. But to say that, oh, well, people say stuff and what was I supposed to do? Like, that is a complete mischaracterization of what actually happened. And he just suggested maybe talking to Neil. And the fact that he had brushed me off so kind of completely on what I was saying, I was really disoriented after that. And I kind of later bumped into Dave, and I was like trying to kind of talk about what had just happened. And Dave thankfully was very validating and said, when he heard what I had to share about Neil, he was like, no, that's like really serious. And he, provided some sanity back to me. But it begs the question, like, why did Rick lie about that? I mean, he has to have remembered something as serious as rape allegations having happened before that conversation, I would think. So I'm very curious about why it came out so differently in his interview with Olivia.
And I was super disturbed at EGA. I mean, Nishay came up and shared all of this, and then shared that, Rick had proposed that they hop on a 3-way call with Nishay, Rick, and Neil Goldsmith. And for those who might not know, Neil Goldsmith was sort of an organizer of the Horizons Perspectives on Psychedelics conference.
He was their
in New
MC.
York. He was their MC for their cultural day, if I recall correctly. And there had been a number of allegations against him about sexual impropriety, abuse, assault.
And not just the cultural day. He was the face of Horizons. Kevin Bogdick was behind the scenes and kind of, doing things just organizationally. And Neil Goldsmith was the face. He was the gatekeeper, deciding who got to share what ideas. And he was the person associated with Horizon. So it wasn't like it is today with different people. It's like he was the guy.
So, right. So when Nishay came to me and said, this had gone on and that Rick had proposed a 3-way call between himself, Nishay, and Neil, to me, that was very clearly like PR and ass covering tactics. And if you look through the record of some of the things that I've published over the last year or two, you will find reference to me talking about one of the most notable people in psychedelic science making PR and ass covering statements with regards to allegations of sexual misconduct. And I am talking about Rick Doblin and statements that were made at EGA. I've avoided, putting that out there until now, but we're here. Like, this has been put on the record by Olivia,
vetted, fact-checked.
The things that Rick has said raise serious questions that Nishay has commented on. And for me, the fact that this was a person who was saying publicly over and over and over again, I want to be a psychedelic therapist. I was like, well, holy shit, this evidences zero understanding of what an appropriate, sort of therapeutic approach would be in this moment. And Lily, I know you were trying to say something, so let me shut up.
Oh, I just, within the sexual violence prevention education domain, which is one of the areas that I do some work in, something that I've used and seen in a number of curriculums ranging from defense forces to universities is this idea of like a spectrum of behavior. There's issues with the spectrum model because sometimes like things that would be considered a lower level sexual assault, like a forced kiss, could for some people be more traumatic and impactful than something that other people might see as more severe, like rape or forced penetration. But still, I think this is really a useful thing to say. On one side of the spectrum, you have like respectful behavior. And then next to that, you have sexualized social behavior. And then next to that, you have sexual harassment. And then at the far end in the red zone, you've got rape and sexual assault. And Nishay, your recounting of your interaction with Rick is very telling, because what you're indicating is that like what we try to get workplaces and social places to do is to be in the green zone, because you assume there's always going to be slips. So if you're in this kind of like respectful workplace relationships and there's a slip, then you end up in sexualized social behavior, which is a little uncomfortable in a professional setting, but also not as significant as, say, sexual harassment or rape. If it's really normalized to have sexualized social behavior, then you slip into harassment. But what Rick is indicating is that anything short of rape and sexual assault doesn't count. And so sexual harassment is okay, sexualized social behavior is okay. I'm relieved, Rick would sort of suggest, oh, I'm relieved that like this isn't as far down the spectrum as that, but it suggests that like all this other behavior is okay, when in reality it's like somebody in position of leadership should be going, oh my gosh, there's a big problem here. We should be endeavoring to have a work context where everybody feels respected and included and comfortable participating and engaging, and where little mistakes just mean that like, oh, there was something a bit sexual and like, let's bring it back into the respect zone, rather than like, oh, well, it wasn't rape, so who cares? Like, what?
And can you talk about Rick's pushback? Yeah, you pointed out the need for external accountability outside of MAPS in order to, I think, prevent MAPS from being focused on its reputational harms. And I think Rick said that's absurd or something to that effect.
Yeah, so this is something that myself and a number of my colleagues here in New Zealand have been working on for some time, which is working for external oversight bodies in a university context. And part of the reason that came about is because if you look at like the hunting ground or various spaces where the number of reports have been monitored by external people, it's like there's really low levels of reports, which means that in the US under the Clery Act, they don't have to file. The Clery Act mandates that like universities in the US would have to say when there's certain crimes, violent crimes happening on their campus, and publish those rates. And so there's a real incentive, especially in the US context, to keep those reporting rates down, because it allows for institutions to say, oh, look, like we don't have this problem here. And so here in New Zealand, watching just in the last couple of years, institutions starting to think through problems of sexual misconduct and how to respond to them, and recognizing that like no institution wants to be the institution with a problem. And so there continues to be this incentive, this built-in conflict of interest around self-monitoring reports. And so when I made the recommendation in the psychedelic context that there has to be some kind of external oversight, it stemmed from my experience consulting and working and agitating within the university sector and other institutional settings. And I think that it's even more important in the context of MAPS and psychedelic therapy, because the track record is so grim. And I found Rick's rebuttal of my comment kind of entertaining in a very tragic way, because it's like, he clearly knows the right thing to say, that patient safety is reputation management and that their interest and investment is patient safety. Unfortunately, there's 40 years of cover-ups and problematic behavior that have not been properly addressed or handled or responded to. And so what he says is very meaningless, because the actual actions don't sync up to that. And I think it further evidences that that's why there's IRBs, institutional review boards. That's why there's ethical protocols and approval that has to happen. That's why the FDA is supposed to be doing oversight. And unfortunately, in these cases, none of those oversight bodies are doing what I think they're responsible for doing. I mean, the notion that an institutional review board would come back and say, well, the study's over, so your sexual assault allegations of one of our researchers is not something that's within our purview to investigate. Like, somebody needs to report that institutional review board and ask questions about the legitimacy of that institutional review board.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that the reality is that as we talk about these contentious issues where people are being abused, the reality is that people don't want to confront people that are potential collaborators, current collaborators, coworkers, superiors, but it's exactly what's necessary. And it's uncomfortable, and it flies in the face of a lot of people's sort of obedience training, as I like to refer to. I mean, basically, there's no democracy at workplaces. Many of these, institutionals in the medical setting are extremely hierarchical organizations. So we, as a society, don't really have great tools for doing it. But it doesn't mean that we don't have moral obligations to speak up when we see actual crimes happening and being perpetuated by people that we are associated with on one level or another.
This is why my colleague Kayla Stewart and I have been working on developing protocols for workplaces that can be implemented. So we've been developing reporting mechanisms to external bodies, and then we've developed all of these various levels of escalation for different procedural pathways for how to confront these sorts of issues in various workplace contexts. And I think that kind of work is so important because, and we're not the only ones doing it, but I think it's just such an important thing to kind of focus on and build out and develop, because people need to have a clear understanding of where they can report, what's going to happen if they report, what are their options if they report, whether it's they're reporting something they saw or they're reporting something that happened to them. It's really important that people who've been victimized have a sense of choice, not just a sense, but like are empowered to make choices about how these things get handled down the track. And so being able to give people a flow chart that says, here's options A through D, and you get to pick which of these you're going to use. And then there's this external way to log complaints anonymously or non-anonymously, so that there's an existing record there. So you could say file, maybe there's 5 incidents with the same person, and all of those get filed, but all of them are anonymous until the 6th complaint. And somebody says, but I've got I can link this to these previous cases. So, it takes consideration. And I think, I have some maybe bias, but as somebody that's given, a significant number of years to this field and to thinking through these issues, and I have a bunch of colleagues in the same boat, I think this is why you turn not just to external bodies, but to experts and people that have really thought through the complexities and the nuances and have experience and have seen things play out in different spaces, to be able to develop protocols that are actually going to function to benefit everybody, to benefit the person who's got an allegation against them, to benefit the organization, so that when it comes through the other side, it's this was hard. We don't want to have to go through this again. These are all the things we learned. These are all the things we're going to be able to change. These are the consequences for the person involved. And we can actually put this behind us and move forward.
Yeah.
And I think, sorry, go ahead, Pace.
Real quick. I mean, we have a vice president right now, Mike Pence, who won't have, a closed door meeting with, a woman. You have these sort of galaxy brain takes everywhere where it's oh, well, I just don't even know how to interact with women in the workplace anymore. And the things that you're talking about are exactly the kind of explicit, spelled out kinds of protocols that, these bad faith people engaging in this argument, are actually asking for. Nishay, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say that the fact that MAPS knew that this is a problem and had so little in place to deal with it, no hotline at the time, and the fact that Jensen was still cited in the published literature that came out as a result of that. So he got the professional credential of being in that study despite what happened. And to me, it's so reckless to the point that it's inevitable that this is going to happen again. It reminded me, there was a Netflix episode on Rotten about the peanut problem. And in the case of peanut allergies, there was a restaurant, and I'm mentioning because I feel like an analogy, a restaurant in the UK run by Mohammed Zaman, who decided to save money by swapping out some expensive oil for peanut oil without telling anyone. And he ended up going to jail for the inevitable death, precisely because it was argued that decision was so reckless and so clear that it was going to lead to someone dying, that it was, de facto a kind of murder, in that case, even if he didn't actually kill the person. I think that there's an analogy to be said about MAPS, that this is so clearly in the record and the nature of the problem that without doing more, they are culpable for the harms that will inevitably result from these kinds of situations.
And that's the thing. If you look through the article, no professional said, wait, what? MDMA does this? I had no clue. In fact, you get quote after quote after quote of individuals who are saying, yeah, this is exactly what, the situations that MDMA contributes to. And as to the points Lily was just making, it's in such a, what we might say, hostile environment around this, right? Where the informed consent excluded the mention of the known sexual suggestibility and the dangers around that, the potential for abuse in those therapeutic relationships, the fact that you've got Rick denying or pushing back on what you said, Nishay, on what you said, Lily, the fact that we've got Brad Burge, MAP's communication director, denying that, you know, Megan reached out when she's saying that she did. The fact that we have, you know, MAPS essentially paying hush money in an attempt to limit their liability. Olivia reports that in the informed consent document, MAPS states it will cover, quote, any costs that arise from treating an injury caused by participating in the study. Doblin said Buissan's case was the result of malpractice rather than a problem with the trial itself, which is a super disturbing distinction. But he goes on to say, so the cost should therefore be the responsibility of her therapist team, and is quoted saying, I believe that MAPS bore no legal liability to pay anything to Miss Buisson, but agreed to pay something to her on a compassionate basis, so she knew she could pay for a certain amount of therapy while her lawyer worked out an arrangement with Jensen and Dreyer. I mean, that sounds real compassionate, no? And so here you have this moment where, you know, there's this attempt to limit legal liability while acknowledging.
You didn't connect it to the fact that he, you know, the money was only transferred once she signed away any future right to sue. I mean, that's a huge part of it.
Precisely, and that's why I was calling it hush money. Sorry, thank you.
But it's not spelled out, so yeah.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, and that's exactly it, right? And so, to me, it seems like this is clearly a hostile terrain for people who have been on the receiving end of these, or for people who are navigating what it is to be a patient, you know, or a participant, for people who are encountering problems and are then encountering researchers who are saying, you're a threat to the field if you speak about this. Like, don't you believe in the merits of psychedelic therapy? Like, keep quiet, and it doesn't matter that people are getting hurt.
A point that I want to make on that is, like, at what point do we see psychedelics or psychedelic therapy just being like, we don't worry about the illegality of them or anything? So we don't see that anytime soon, right? That could be 40 years, literally 40 years, 40, 50 years away. That could be where it's not a thing. And if the attitude right now is, yeah, kind of shut up because you might affect the field, that same exact attitude is going to transfer when you start having whatever state legalize it or whatever. That's not going to suddenly change because regulations changed around it. Let's say that, let's just, in a hypothetical scenario, say that Oregon has psychedelic therapy is legalized, let's say. That same attitude is going to exist within a legal framework because they don't want the legal framework to be to get challenged, because maybe more regulations come, maybe it's outlawed. So if you're not willing to address it now, I don't see, and say that the field is going to suffer if women come forward or quote unquote polarizing people come forward. That same attitude is going to be there in a legal state where, you know, they don't want regulations to go backwards there. So I don't really buy that argument that coming forward about sexual assault or getting headlines or media is going to really that attitude isn't going to suddenly stop when legalization occurs, is what I'm trying to say.
For sure.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of those things, what you just said, like, and has been stated in the Quartz article by Olivia, you know, this idea that these allegations where, you know, that this is going to cause the field to suffer. This is similar to some pushback I saw online where people said, well, you know, I just see this article as like an attempt to slander the movement. And I mean, I gotta say, the movement, you know, includes the people who are suffering. So that logic is so strange to me, where, you know, it reminds me of sort of one of those old mean, we're talking about psychedelics here. There's a lot of like, woke light worker wisdom out there. But one of those old canards is like anything that can be destroyed by the truth probably should be destroyed by the truth. It's just, and beyond that, I mean, it's a process question. For so many practitioners of some kind of healing art, to not build into one's process certain safety guards, certain institutional check-ins, harm reduction, methodologies. It's bananas. Nishay, what you got?
Yeah, well, it kind of correlate to what you were saying is, any situation that any loophole that can be exploited by bad actors will be exploited by bad actors. And that's one thing. There are some people that like just have this good faith in like psychedelics and think that things will just work out because they don't think in terms of the way that predators think. And then there are predators who are looking for ways to exploit vulnerable people. And this is something that actually Alicia Danforth has started talking about. I believe her talk at ICPR this year is going to be on this subject in particular. And she writes that it became very apparent to me that there are certain personality types that are drawn to situations in which they're in close proximity to people who are vulnerable and open. They seek to manipulate and have a very unhealthy relationship with power. And so when we are asking, like, who are the people who are choosing to come forward and self-identify as psychedelic therapists or shamans, there are a large percentage of them who get off on, for lack of a better term, this power dynamic and enjoy treating, people like cat and mouse games around their, vulnerable impressionability. And if you're not going to acknowledge the reality of that threat and account for that in the way you're going about designing these studies, then you're leaving the field open for those people to come in and do as they please.
An analogy from ecology would be the ecology of mimics. And I like to think about, psychopaths and sociopaths as essentially people who are mimicking being a normal, caring human being. And one of the things about mimic ecology is that when mimics are in low frequency, there is no incentive of the system to expend energy towards their regulation, and mimics are quite prolific. They flourish. And what do we mean by that? Well, their numbers increase. There's no check against them. And so their numbers increase, and eventually they start causing damage. The system ultimately has to respond to mimics, to fakes, by increasing its ability to detect and punish.
So I think that's the perfect transition into sort of what can we do and where do we go from here questions. And Lily, if there was something you wanted to say, I was going to frame a little bit of the beginning of this, but I jumped in just before you.
I just wanted to loop back very briefly to this notion that like this is going to hurt the movement, as though the people who are being harmed aren't part of the movement. And I remember one of the common sort of attempts at silencing that I experienced a number of years ago was very pointed questions very frequently of, why are you doing this? As though and Sarah Ahmed points this out in her book, Living a Feminist Life. When you name the problem, you become the problem. And there I was trying to name the problem. And there I was facing charges that I was the problem. And I said very frequently, like, because I love this work, because I love these materials, because I care about women and women's health and women's safety, I would like to protect, other people from having to go through something like this. And the messaging that I got repeatedly was, to kind of paraphrase, like, you don't matter. I didn't matter, not enough, And so it was like, well, you need to shut up and go away. Your experience doesn't count. The safety of women doesn't count. Like, this movement is more important, which to me just demonstrates a real, that's completely flies in the face of how the movement presents itself. It's supposed to be about compassion and healing and all these things that like were the things that drew me in to begin with. And my answer to the charge, because people will say about this podcast and they'll say about this article, like, what do you guys have against psychedelics? Or, this is like, I love these things and here you are hurting them. And all I can really say back is like, obviously to those critics, like, we have very different definitions of love.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, we have this conversation, like, I have this conversation because I love these substances. I think that they have significant potential to make a number of important changes, and because I love the people who are turning to them for support, you know, and who need them and who need to be able to access them without a therapist raping them in their moment of vulnerability and need.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of fierce compassion that needs to be invoked whenever you know, there's something that is really important and valuable. It's the compassion that and fierceness that, you know, parents have for their children, and, you know, the deep care, I think, often gets glossed over when you're pointing out problems. But I would argue that, you know, the whole reason why we're having this conversation, why +3 came into existence, is you know, a place of deep care, while seeing things in the movement that were not being adequately addressed by the people who were supposed to be, you know, the leaders and the, you know, the thought leaders and the institutional leaders and those, you know, showing the way forward. And, you know, we've had conversations on many occasions here where we realized, through a process of seeing things problems that should have been addressed in a professional, caring, open, active manner, not being addressed. And you know, that's kind of why we're here.
Well, and when you say that, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, it's worse than failure. It's self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
It's self-interest at the expense of others. I think it's important to recognize, too, that 26% of people who've been sexually victimized consider suicide to the point of devising a plan. So when we talk about the harms of sexual violence, especially when it's committed by a therapist, we are talking about potentially life-threatening consequences in already dire situations.
Mm-hmm.
And Pace, when you talk about, you know, the negligence or failure to act on institutional leaders or so-called thought leaders or whoever, like, the thing that came into mind was the Ella Baker quote, former or organizer for SNCC students for nonviolent. You know, she said strong people don't need strong leaders, right? The notion that we can self-organize, the notion that, like, we shouldn't be looking to other outside actors to solve these problems for us. The fact that, you know, to my opinion, and as I said in considerations on the breach, we are the people who are in psychedelic spaces. We are the people to whom we are all accountable to. And so, like, this notion that somebody else is going to come in and address these problems for us doesn't hold, to my mind. And so when we look at where we're going from here, what we might be able to do about it, I mean, there are a few questions that come up that I'd like to kick this off with. I mean, there are questions of how effective MDMA is, and is it actually a tenable treatment in light of this abuse? You know, how much evidence do we have? Olivia linked to a study in her article called "A Randomized Controlled Pilot Study of MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy for the Treatment of Resistant Chronic Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder," that found that that we did not see statistically significant reductions in CAPS scores, that's clinician administered PTSD scale, although there was clinically and statistically significant self-reported post-traumatic diagnostic scale improvement. And so looking at this, as people are saying, hey, you know, we need to be quiet because it's going to damage all of these potentially effective or miraculous cures, do we actually have evidence that these things are as effective or miraculous as they're being claimed? We have questions about who wants to be a clinician and why, who's vetting that, especially as MAPS is talking about, you know, skyrocketing the number of protocol trainees into the hundreds. What does it mean when we have training exclusivity by people who have a record of fuck-ups and cover-ups and unwillingness to engage with these issues? I mean, do y'all have ideas of what might exist to help us move forward, to help get additional accountability? I'll just throw it out there.
Well, I feel like, I mean, I've personally and heard from many people who have had profound trauma integration work facilitated by MDMA. And so we do know, like, even if on a study, it's not always showing, like, I do believe that it can be very powerful. I don't think that you need to have rock star psychedelic therapists there with you. Like, a lot of the people who have benefited in the context of sitting with a friend, sitting with someone who is there for them. And even in the studies, like, the way that therapists talk about, this is a spontaneous, self-produced process that they are there
the
to sit
inner
for.
healer.
Yeah, so it's not even about that therapist. That therapist is there to provide support. And if we encourage community forms of support that are not, that are flattened, that don't have these power differentials and dynamics, I think that you can have both the powerful, warm, and compassionate ability to look into very difficult aspects of your past and not have to be victim to these people who get off on being the rock star therapist that you're graciously been allowed to be in their presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to some of our core, objectives. I think we'd like to see decriminalization come to fruition because we're yes and when it comes to medicalization. Like, there are clearly people with complex PTSD and other issues where somebody who has training in those issues could be very helpful. I've also met people who've resolved their suicidal ideations with regular administrations of smaller doses of LSD. I've met other people who've cured their own PTSD by simply listening to Bach and taking some MDMA. So, I mean, these anecdotes are out there, but I mean, I don't want to, my point is, I don't want to deny anybody the experience that they would like to have.
I just think I would like to add onto that. I think part of this needs to be in conversation with a more robust ideological harm reduction education approach to being able to identify these mimicking personalities, being able to identify cult-like dynamics. This should be taught to people. This is more important than most of what you're taught in grade school. And so if you, and one of the things that I have learned the hard way growing up is that give people enough time and they will show you who they are. So in terms of getting friends to sit, there are ways to tell who is really your friend. This is not a sign, but whereas a therapist that you're just meeting, you don't have 10 years of having that person back you up to know that they're there for you. So you just cannot have that kind of trust. But then again, if you're not taught to look for the warning signs, you could pick a friend that's not actually a friend. So part of it is just educating on these manipulative tactics, manipulative dynamics that the establishment figures in the field have not wanted us to talk about.
I totally agree. And I think that one of the things that makes direct conversations about power so difficult to have is that in most scenarios, there are asymmetries in the room with the person you're having those conversations.
And it's not in their interest for this education to happen. Like, they don't, it doesn't work as well if people can see it. It works so well because there are these smoke and mirrors games that people have learned to do. And so it's not in their interest to share the secrets of their trade.
No.
Yeah, I think all these questions and considerations are really significant. Like, when I was talking with my close friend after he'd read the article, and we were talking through some of the ideas that we were having, and at the end of our conversation, he goes, "This article's really raised for me questions about the fundamental tenability or untenability of applying MDMA to a therapeutic setting." And at first I was sort of like, oh, really? But then I thought, well, think about it, because all of the people, it would seem that the gross majority of people who are involved in this work at this juncture are either abusers, silencers, enablers, or cover-uppers. You know, like at a certain point, it's like everybody's hands are dirty. I don't know. I don't know any practitioners whose hands are clean in the sense of like they are closely, and this is just maybe a function of the network that that was exposed to, but like they are either, they know abusers and they know that this is a problem, and they've participated in trying to get me or others to shut up about it. I think that that's a problem. I also think like this is different from a pharmaceutical intervention in that it's experience-based, and the container for that experience is necessarily dependent on a trusting relationship. And when a person has been supposedly vetted and endorsed by an organization like MAPS, it's supposed to add an aura of trust. But that trust we're seeing is not a thing that can really be safely placed in these people, which is not reflective at all of their patients, and is entirely reflective of an organization that is completely failing in its due diligence and duty of care to vet these people and ensure that that trust is properly placed.
Well, but, and that's real quick, just that's one of the points I've made about the MAPS integration list for quite a while, right? That we've got people who are on that list who have been known to be abusive, who have been fumbled in their removal for one reason or another. I think MAPS is now running a disclaimer on that says like, oh, none of, you know, the inclusion of these people on the list is not an endorsement.
Yeah.
But also you've created the list. So there is unquestionably an implicit endorsement. You have put them up there, and in the context of medicalized treatment, in the context of the rising integration industry, you know, there is a clear-cut business interest in getting your practice and your name up on the MAPS integration list. And so, you know, I think that highlights the need for external accountability. I think that highlights the need for greater openness and discussion about these issues. And I think that goes back to a point that Lily's made about how open access to these compounds and that Pace made about decriminalization, how that can limit some of the power and abuse of clinicians. And as Nishay also pointed out, right, like sitting with a friend, doing this with people who are experienced but not credentialed, there's so much potential for positive work there. Sorry, Pace, you indicated.
No, I mean, I just want to underscore the fact that, you know, one of the main reasons why, I mean, we can look at cannabis. I mean, cannabis legislation has gone extremely slowly because, you know, like I studied crops. If we grow cannabis the way we grow tomatoes, the profit goes right out of it. You know, we're talking about really nice chronic weed for, you know, $5 at the high end. And so there is this like disconnect between, you know, these goals of justice and decriminalization, and then the, you know, the farmers and the entrenched underground workers. And then when we're talking about, you know, the psychedelic therapy, there's, you know, medicalizers want a situation where, you know, $6,000, $10,000 for a couple of sessions is the norm. That's how everybody pays off their medical, you know, their medical school loans. Like it's a case of shoving the experience into a political and economic system that demands certain things. Otherwise, like I guess like Too Long didn't read like, this is why we can't have nice things.
It also sets the stage for the large corporate backed entities or you know, founders fund, Teal sponsored clinics like Mindbloom to come in and undercut the market, right? To eat into everybody else's profit margins, as we've seen with Starbucks, as we've seen with Uber, as we've seen with all of these so-called disruptive businesses that have come in and priced people out and then been able to dominate markets. So there's a whole bunch of tectonic plates moving around those financial interests as well.
I would go so far as to say that, like, you know, there's sort of a mind control by omission going on here, like where we, you know, have excluded the spectrum of, you know, cognitive states that are available to the vast majority of us, you know, through prohibition. And, you know, one can roll the dice and take the risk, and that's usually a function of privilege and time available to explore these states of consciousness. But you know, we get back to things like control. I mean, the institutions that want us all to, you know, have consumer confidence in the stock market and, you know, realize that I don't know, having a pension fund is better than having access to land that's farmable and a functioning community. I mean, these are just like really fundamental things that get down to our states of consciousness and how we spend our time. A lot of that I've critiqued specifically the idea of this determinism that certain biochemical states are going to lead to certain socio-political outcomes. Yet, how we spend our time and where we get our pleasure, like, these are monetized things. These are some of the only monetized things.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that was coherent.
Yeah. Lily, was there some stuff you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of note two things I think are really critical in terms of thinking about paths forward. I think that there needs to be some kind of external body, not just for MAPS, but for any organization, corporation, academic institution that's conducting research on psychedelics, because frankly, it seems to me that like there are ethical issues and considerations here and histories here that are quite distinct from a lot of other disciplines, and there's risks here that are quite unique. And so like it's a market that needs to be quite heavily regulated. But I also think that, and maybe that I should have started with this, like I think all of this really does create a very robust argument in support of decriminalization more broadly, because even like prohibition light or medicalization will embolden abusers within the therapeutic context. As long as therapy is like the source that people go to for this, and that relationship is like all the more, the power differential is all the more potent because of the limited access, this is going to continue to be a serious problem. And again, like I think there's pretty significant questions to be raised about who wants to do this kind of work in the first place, and where they're kind of coming from. But I think like when I think of what would be a wonderful future is one where people have a range of modes of access to these sorts of experiences and are able to select for themselves if they want to work with a therapist, if they want to have a friend sit for them, or whatever they think is going to be the most conducive to what they feel that they need.
Absolutely.
I think that sounds like a pretty good place to wrap for today.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone for listening. Thanks, Lily, for joining us and share your expertise. And hopefully we'll see some responses to this article as the weeks go on.
Yeah. And
thanks so much for having me, y'all.
Yeah, definitely. If anything about this episode made you have thoughts or feelings or words, send us a message.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Cheers.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Okay, so don't turn off your video.
Turn off audio though.
No, we're saying hello to our Patreon subscribers. So this was, a tougher one, but I mean, we don't shy away from the hard issues, because otherwise, what the fuck are we doing?
Yeah, I mean,
well,
I think there are a couple like high crimes and misdemeanors that are in this space. one of them,
I like
one of them is dosing people without their knowledge.
Oh my God, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And like another one is abusing your position as a therapist to someone who is really looking for your help. If you do those things, you need to be removed from the community, period, end of story. That's it. And anyone who covers up for that, like, that needs to be publicly exposed.
Well, and that's a really interesting.
That's it. I don't have any. Like, that's it. Am I wrong?
I don't disagree in the slightest. I think. I think in part, some of the denials that are coming out of MAPS at this point are alarming. I know that there are other allegations floating around that people at MAPS have been well aware of for quite some time. Their awareness of those allegations has also been documented. So if and when those allegations break publicly, it will be very interesting to see if those figures attempt to state their ignorance yet again, because those are situations where if they claim ignorance, I suspect certain people will be able to demonstrate that no, we have the receipts to show that, even if you want to claim ignorance on past cases, we can show it here. So this is very much an unfolding series of shitty situations.
But to loop it back, like at the point where everybody who's either committed these sorts of abuses or participated in covering them up, like, who's left?
I mean, these are paradigm shift questions.
I also understand.
You know?
You guys might hate me, but like I get why certain people don't want to talk about certain things that are involved in the institutions. Like I understand it, and I kind of feel that's why we're doing what we're doing. Because I get it. It's tough to do it right away, you know.
Well, I mean, I would say that one of the reasons why we're able to have these conversations is that I think nobody on this podcast is currently in training to become an MDMA therapist. Like, you know, we happen to have quite a bit of accumulated knowledge and related experience, but we don't have that kind of skin in the game.
Yep.
And we've also, many of us, had a lot of pushback from trying, like, had silencing tactics and ostracization thrown at us, and through a survival practice found each other and linked up to create a kind of counter narrative. And so it's come out of our flesh and blood grappling with this stuff. And that's part of, I was talking to Lily, part of the amazing thing about this article is this has been so many years in the making. Several of us were behind, you know, aspects of that journalism, or, you know, not, you know, speaking with the journalists and sharing information publicly. And it's been a long time. That said, going to EGA and speaking, you know, with the Rick situation, I got up on stage and I was, you know, said there's a person doing some things, and I didn't feel comfortable saying into a recorded on camera into a microphone, it's Neil Goldsmith, because I was scared. And afterwards, someone in the audience came up to me and he said that he had been a victim of sexual assault as a child, and he was concerned that I was not naming names, but I didn't feel safe doing that on my own. I wanted to connect with people that could provide that kind of community to counter the kind of threats coming from people who are trying to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, I would go on, Lily.
Oh, just in terms of naming names, like, I think it's important to name names, but I also think that there can be benefit to not. I was revisiting the New York Mag piece that that Rachel Monroe put in that features parts of my story, and I had scrolled to the bottom of the page kind of on accident, and accidentally sort of like my eyes grazed a comment, you know, which is like not a thing you ever want to do.
Read the comments.
And that sort of thing. And somebody was really asking this question of like, why didn't she name the abuser? Why didn't she? And in my case, the answer is really easy. Like, my abuser has multiple murder allegations against him. Like, I'm not really interested in being killed. But also on another level, when I thought it through prior to the publishing of the piece, was like, this isn't just a him problem. This is a really rampant problem. And in some ways, not naming specific people has a certain benefit, because instead of people being able to even scapegoat or fixate on one person, it's like, oh no, like, this is a really widespread problem, and there's this one person and we should do something about that. But also, like, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, to answer your earlier question about, like, you know, is any of this salvageable? I mean, I would, you know, obviously we're talking about rampant misogyny, you know, and there have been evolutions on these discussions, and some of them have been quite rapid, even though, you know, many of us participated in, the majority of us participated in all kinds of, you know, harmful narratives, whether it be about, you know, different now protected classes or other folks that we think, you know, differently. We have evolved in terms of our thoughts about, you know, who is a full human.
Wait, so you're saying we have evolved? Like,
I mean, I get, like, no. So first of all, I'm just going to say my thoughts are a little muddled here, but, like, I guess I'm just trying to think about how cultures can evolve from if everybody's shit, how do people get better? You know?
Well, and ContraPoints made a great point about that. And she was speaking on stage at one point, and she was like, how many of you were woke about trans issues in 2010? You know,
that's kind of what I'm pointing at. Yeah. Right.
Well, and I think there's also, to go back to some of what Lily said, and I think I've discussed it here. I definitely discussed it on James Kent's Dose Nation podcast, which may be up or is coming out
looking
soon.
forward to that.
But like, when I started out, I wasn't naming names. I was naming dynamics because I had this, I view it as kind of naive now, but I had this idea that like, it's not about the people, it is about the dynamics. If we can help facilitate and promote pattern recognition, I can get the fuck off the stage. I can get the fuck away from the microphone. Like, we can all do the work together of looking for the shitty patterns and like engaging and correcting them. What became apparent to me was that some people can't handle those abstractions, or that because they're seen as abstract, it's never real enough. It's never, it's sort of the opposite of like, oh, it's just this person and we need to deal with that. It's like, oh, this is just a thing, and this thing isn't actually attached to anyone. And I mean, the reality for me as a man in this space has been that like, I've seen a lot of shit go down firsthand. I mean, Nishay, going back years with you, like, we've seen some shit together, and like, whether it was speaking up for around some of the Compass stuff when K-Mac was being called, a crazy bitch for some of her narratives, and I never caught flack in that same way. I mean, people had complaints, but not those. Or going back to some of the issues when Nishay, when we were working on the DMT book, and we had
David J. Brown, he was the editor of the bulletin that MAPS puts out, and they never addressed what happened where David J. Brown, an older man, was actively doing an online bullying campaign against a pregnant graduate student. Like, it's crazy. MAPS never did anything about that.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to me that like, it was a team of women in their early 20s, maybe one in their late teens even, and myself, who was brought on sort of, partway through. Y'all had started that without me, and like, it wasn't. There were moments where like, all it took in some ways were a couple Facebook comments from me saying, "Hey, why are you doing this? Look at your shit. What's going on here?" And suddenly, that fell by the wayside. And to me, it all just seemed so absurd. And the fact that this has continued on and on and on, and the number of women who I've encountered in these spaces who have, not only these direct experiences of therapist or practitioner abuse, but also just the ingrained, ongoing misogyny in all of these different spheres of the field. It's
one of the manifestations of this, and I could see it really clearly once I, got out and started working in gender studies and engaging with a lot of feminist colleagues and feminist texts, it became even more obvious. But within the psychedelic space, like, there is quite a strong new age spiritual component. And within that component, there's this notion of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And we see those things in that setting inscribed into cosmic law, where it's taking like those heteronormative, super traditional regressive gender roles and like making them some kind of universal cosmic truth. I think that that's really pervasive and really rampant in the psychedelic culture, and comes to bear on things like the dyad, where it's like, we need the masculine and feminine presence, or when people are in healing spaces and it's like, oh, we need you to access your feminine blah blah blah, and it's like, what? Like, what? But those ideas are so, it can be subtle at times, but they're really tied in with traditional gender roles. And I think the psychedelic space is like 50 years behind, or really regressive in some really troubling ways. And we see that coming through in these various manifestations of misogyny and violence towards women.
Yeah, I mean, and why wouldn't it be, a few decades behind the rest of the world, or the vanguard on these issues, when the most vibrant cultural model that we have for psychedelic spaces is like 1967. I mean, we have to just, grapple with the fact that our, conceptions of what is the highest good just happens to conform to whatever is, regionally and culturally specific to our own experiences, psychedelics are definitely a giant funhouse mirror if among other things. And, you can end up sort of talking yourself in circles with your own assumptions about reality and then externalizing them.
Yay.
Which, has its upsides too.
It can be a little fun if it's a fun loop.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's all bad.
No, it's just there's an awful lot of cleaning to be done in order to get to have the ontological discussions. It's like when Daniel Pinchbeck's fiance piped in to call us social
bullies.
Justice warrior bullies and the like. It's like, well, if Pinchbeck would just go away and stop trying to insert himself into these spaces, like it's not like we're following up on him to find out what he's up to. It's that he keeps popping up in all of these public spots.
High crimes and misdemeanors. You gotta go.
And he took some. He took some like mailing list. Remember, there was a situation where a year or so ago, suddenly everybody was getting his.
I got an email from the guy. It's like, do you really want to be emailing me?
So he's like gone out of his way to put people in the community on his listserv to broadcast what he's doing in the community. And so it's not like we have a right to respond to that.
And this has been going on forever. When I first got involved in this years ago, like I was immediately warned, do not work with Daniel Pinchbeck. Like he was the first person that I was warned by other people in positions of leadership in the space. Do not work with them. And the fact that he's still around and like hasn't gotten a hint, like it just shows like it's not even double down, triple down, quadruple down. It's just won't.
But this
won't take the hint. Like
it's not a fucking hint at this point.
You're right.
This is important because like when we look at the data in terms of behavioral indications that in particular among men, behavioral indications that they are a risk of committing sexual violence, one of the main danger cues is persistence. So they make an advance and they're told no, and usually really politely, and then they keep making an advance and they use persistence to wear somebody
so doing
down.
the same thing that he did with women to the community,
right?
Like,
that's
just
exactly what he's
different,
doing. Like
a different level.
He persists in his attempts to penetrate the community. Like,
nevertheless, he persisted.
Yeah, I mean, so we didn't really talk about him too much, but he was in the article, and in it, he is positioning himself as some kind of reformer who has unique knowledge about men and their bad behaviors. I mean, he wrote about it in his book. He said, all of my own, traumas from not having good models of being a man or something. He like sort of
he blamed women. He
blamed
his mother and his grandmother.
And the solution was the problem was also monogamy. And if women were just more available, men wouldn't be having this problem.
We
did talk about that.
Talking about Pinchbeck is just so fucking annoying at this point. Like,
well,
but
we're going to be talking about him a bit in the next
Yeah.
episode. So.
It's just, I mean, it's one of these things though. It's like you either like it goes back to what we're just discussing. You either have to be confrontational when bad actors are taking up space, or you endorse them and allow them. And guess what? It can be uncomfortable to the person who says, "Oh, are you still here?" But, when somebody has, abused somebody in my community and they show up at one of my events and I do throw them, every time they show up, I have to say, get the fuck out of here. You're not
Leave.
welcome.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
sorry. That's the way it has to work, you know?
And I was told by a prominent anthropologist in the field that, you know, if I was committed to cleaning the space, I was going to spend all of my time cleaning the space. And frankly, like, fuck, if we can't have a clean space, what the fuck is the point, you know?
It's very zen.
Yeah. I mean, I really thought when I got involved in psychedelics, like, you know, 14 years ago, I thought these are materials that offer tools to confront the most troubling phenomena within our society and within ourselves. This is the point, to me, to my mind. This is just an N of one, but like, this is the point of the enterprise, is to actually be able to engage with these sorts of problems. And so it just makes these, like, the situation as it is that much more absurd.
Well, it's like the people that don't want to do that on an interpersonal level, it suggests perhaps they're not that interested in helping people do that on an individual level, that's not their primary reason to be engaging with the psychedelics.
Look,
I mean, people want
say,
simple solutions.
Like, I think I think the vast majority of people who are involved in this work in this space, I think they do want to do the right thing. I think they don't want to see this out there, you know, absolutely don't. But, you know, at the same time, we are all complicit if we see it going on, and we're not saying anything about it.
Well, it's not as fun to be in the weeds with this stuff than to just be tripping out at a music festival, you know? And so for a lot of people, it's seen as like harshing their mellow or whatever, you know? And so the thing is, like, we don't want, we would rather be doing other things, like Dave was saying, but since the reality of the situation is that there are these problematic things, we need to address them and provide a way for other people who see similarly to come together and, you know, put other alternative community norms out into the open.
Sure. And I mean, I guess it's just this rejection of a fucking head in the sand approach to real problems where, you know, it's just not acceptable to us to take somebody's, you know, silencing tactics as somehow on the same footing and value of actually dealing with the problem, so that instead of dealing with the perception that the problem isn't here, instead we do the work so that the problem isn't here. Well, at least it's managed.
I think it's hilarious that on the Psychedelic Sisters in Arms series, like, I wrote something loosely titled "Time's Up for Silencing Tactics," and I was silenced for writing that. I was, you know, kicked off the women's listserv. So it's just with no shame or acknowledgement of the irony, just like people are willing to go with it, who are, you know, that's what they're interested in.
I'm getting to a point where it's like, I have enough recognition of silencing tactics and what they look like and everything else that, like, when I encounter them, it's just an indication that I'm doing something right. You know? Like,
Absolutely.
Not everybody's gonna like me, and if people are getting pissed off because I'm agitating on these ideas, like, so be it. You know, this is exactly what I want to be stirring the pot around.
Yeah,
agitating is an active word, because you know, a lot of people don't actually understand the technical term of that, but it's like kind of, you know, making noise and being kind of an asshole because you have an agenda for change. And agitation all the way.
I mean, it's like people can say what they will about various confrontational tactics, but it's like they're obviously working because they've gotten under your skin. And at the point where you have to keep...
What social good has been accomplished without agitation?
Right. Well,
Well, but those are the narratives that, you know, the liberals and moderates want to, you know, it keeps them comfortable. I mean, there was just a great, well, sorry, go ahead, Pace.
No, go on.
Just looking at the exchange, well, I won't get into that, but you know, ultimately, like, the notion that we can have change without, you know, when we have so many
it's not what change is.
Right, but that's just it, right? There are systemic components, there are institutions that have investment in the way things are, and the notion that we can somehow get free of that or approach more liberatory praxis without upsetting those hierarchies. Like, I'm sorry, that just doesn't hold. Like, and we have, you know, what it took to get like the 8-hour workday, what it took to end formal segregation, right? Like what it took. If we look through the history, this notion that, oh, we can make quiet, calm, peaceful change from the inside just doesn't hold. It's always taken outside agitation, even if that's been in tandem with internal actors. You don't,
I mean, if people want to work on the inside to reform things, I'm sure it takes them as well. And
for sure. And I'm not saying it doesn't take them, but look at the not Vanguard effect, sorry, but look at the way that like the way that you can stretch the Overton window, the way that like suddenly people who are in institutions who are being seen as too radical, at the point where you get people who are more radical than them, suddenly they start looking like reasonable actors. And so like the way that pressure can be applied, it requires, I think, if not coalitions, at least different affinity groups applying pressure along the lines that make sense to them.
And that is not the same as bullying. Agitation, it just isn't. You know, it's like some people might not be able to discern the difference from the outside, but just because we're upset and we're pushing back against the status quo does not make us bullies.
Don't bully the bosses. It's one of these things where there's a lot of, and I think it's important to call it out. There's a lot of bad faith arguments that are put forth by people who either, and I'm constantly doing this when I'm, in contentious situations with people. I'm like, are we dealing with somebody who is being disingenuous, or is this just ignorance here?
Right.
Or is there some sort of mix between the two?
The vampires and zombies scenario.
Right. Which I loved that talk that you made, because it's a good metaphor. But like these people who are out there, they have this sort of liberal idea where we celebrate the achievements that, in some sort of retrospective gloss, we say, oh, well, the Civil Rights Act was passed by these senators, without, spending too much time talking about some of the marches and some of the clashes that happened. We celebrate all kinds of victories that were achieved by, agitation and riots. And then it's always the job of the status quo to say, okay, that was all good, but no more. Don't use those tactics to get more change and gain more power and gain more concessions from people like me, because that would make me uncomfortable,
Don't make the billionaires feel bad.
They might cry on TV.
They might cry in board meetings too. Maybe not billionaires, but they might cry in board meetings.
George Goldsmith certainly did.
Well, should we wrap? I feel like we've
I think we should formally end. We've probably exhausted the last two people who are watching this.
Thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Thanks a lot.
So long.
Bye.
Toodles.